And now Iraq, for all intents and purposes, it's almost an Iranian client state.
Correct. Yeah. And do you think that Saudi Arabia is a good counterbalance, though,
Mm-mm.
or
No.
American based?
You know,
So there's no counterbalance to Iran right now, in
not
your view?
really. There's an old saying, there is no such thing as permanent relationships, only permanent interests. The United States has an interest in keeping Iran at bay, but Saudi Arabia has an interest in neighborly relations. And so we can't bank on the notion that Saudi Arabia is always going to be on the verge of a state of war with Iran, especially with Mohammed bin Salman. He's far more pragmatic than the earlier generation of Saudi leaders. You know, it cost them a lot of money to constantly prepare for war with Iran. And the Iranians would kick their butts in a couple of weeks, probably even with American assistance. At the same time, we're at, what's it called? Rashid, I think, in south of Doha in Qatar. And we're all over Saudi Arabia. We don't really want to be there. I say in my first book, The Reluctant Spy, that when I got back from Pakistan in the middle of 2002, I got promoted on the strength of the Abu Zubaydah capture. And I was named the executive assistant to the CIA's deputy director for operations. So my first day on that job, I went in and I said, "So, what are we doing?" And he said, the deputy director said, "Actually, I can't tell you what we're doing yet. You need to go up to the 6th floor and sign some secrecy agreements." So I went up to the 6th floor. The security officer had laid out these 6 separate secrecy agreements. A secrecy agreement says that you can never talk about these things. You take them to your grave unless they're declassified. These have been declassified. So I signed 6 of them. He had them all laid out. And when I finished the 6, I said, "Okay." I said, "So what's up?" And the guy took a breath and he said, "Well, early next year, we're going to invade Iraq. We're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. And we're going to open the world's largest Air Force base. And we're going to move all of our air assets out of Saudi Arabia into Iraq so that we can deprive Osama bin Laden of the ability of saying that we are polluting the land of the 2 holy mosques."
Mm.
And I was dumbfounded. And I said, "But we haven't captured bin Laden yet." And he said, "The decision's been made and the battle lines are drawn." He said, "The pro-invasion faction is OVP, Office of the Vice President, OSD, Office of the Secretary of Defense, and NSC. And the anti-invasion faction is the State Department, the CIA, and the Joint Chiefs of Staff."
Mm.
And he said, "But the decision's been made." So I went back to the office, and the deputy director said, "You sign everything?" And I said, "Are they out of their minds?" And he said, "Yes, but the decision's been made." And so 6 months later, we invaded Iraq.
John, when these things are happening, so like, that there is a larger mission at hand. What's going through your mind? It's a top-down decision.
It's a top-down decision, and the CIA, this is something most Americans don't understand. The CIA is not a policy organization. It's a policy support organization. So the CIA doesn't make these decisions. The decisions have to come from the White House. And so when the decision is made, you do as you're told.
How much influence do you think Cheney had on Bush?
100% of the decision-making on these issues came from Cheney.
Wow.
Yeah, this was all Dick Cheney, all of it.
And at the time, they were close with Chalabi. Who on the external side, people can be easily fooled. I can see how, a lot of...
Chalabi was a used car salesman.
Yeah, he was like very well spoken.
Boy, was he. $2,000 suits.
Right. So can you talk a little about that? I mean, how extensive is a vetting process when it comes to discussing like leadership transition?
Well, that's an important issue. So just as background, Ahmed Chalabi was very unusual in that he was a Shia Muslim Kurd. there are like a handful of them, right? Almost all Kurds are Sunni Muslim. So his parents took him out of Iraq in 1965, and they moved to Jordan. And his parents stressed education, so he was educated in the UK, got degrees in finance, went back to Jordan, and started a bank called Petrobank. And this became the go-to bank for Iraqi immigrants in Jordan, right? People put their life savings in Petrobank. And Petrobank was functioning for years until the late 1980s. And in the late 1980s, Ahmed Chalabi stole all $36 million that was in Petrobank, transferred it to accounts in Switzerland and London, and literally escaped the country in the trunk of his secretary's car. She drove him across the border into Syria, and then he flew from Damascus to London. He went on trial in Jordan in absentia and was sentenced to death, right? He bankrupted literally every Iraqi in Jordan. So, sentenced in absentia to death. He's living the high life in London on the money that he stole. Bought a townhouse in Mayfair, central London, right by Harrods.
Oh, my.
Oh, yeah, living large. And so Iraq invades Kuwait. The State Department says to the CIA, we need to create some sort of an opposition, a unified opposition group. The CIA says, okay, we're going to create this group called the Iraqi National Congress, the INC. We're going to get all the various Iraqi opposition groups together. They'll all be under the INC umbrella. This was done at a conference in Vienna, Austria, in the fall of 1990. And frankly, the reason why the CIA thought that Chalabi was attractive at the time is because he was very Western in his orientation, and his English was as good as ours. That was really the bottom line. And then the Jordanians came to us and said, whoa, wait a minute. This guy's got a death sentence over his head in Jordan. And this is what he did. He's a friggin' criminal. So we said to the Jordanians, well, exigent circumstances, maybe the king could pardon him. That would make it easier for everybody. And the king pardons him. The CIA starts to transfer money to the Iraqi National Congress, and it goes directly into Chalabi's pockets. And he stole millions of dollars of the CIA's money and transferred them into secret accounts in Switzerland. So the CIA in 1991 issued something called a burn notice, where a cable is sent to every CIA officer in the world saying, there's this guy, Ahmed Chalabi, he's a criminal, he stole from us, and no CIA employee is permitted to have any contact with him. He's burned, he's dead to us, right? So then, 11 years later, Dick Cheney says, we're going to overthrow Saddam Hussein. We're going to need to install somebody as the president of Iraq. I like this guy, Ahmed Chalabi. And the CIA said, well, wait a minute now. We dealt with Chalabi a decade ago. He's a thief. He's a criminal. He's a liar. We can't trust him. The Jordanians want to kill him. He's a Shia. And Cheney said, I want you to deal with him anyway. And George Tenet stood up to Cheney and said, no, we have a burn notice on Chalabi. We're not going to talk to him, and we're not going to fund him. And so Cheney said, then I'll fund him. So they created an internal intelligence organization within the Office of the Secretary of Defense, headed by an Undersecretary of Defense for Intelligence, a position that never existed before. And all of a sudden, at the CIA, we start getting these very specific intelligence reports. Iraqi chemical weapons can be found at this location. Okay, then we send the United Nations inspection team to the location. There's nothing there. Okay, well, there are chemical weapons at this other location. And then we send the team there. There are no chemical weapons. Turns out Chalabi was just making this stuff up, passing it to the Pentagon, taking the Pentagon's millions of dollars, pocketing that, and then there were no weapons of mass destruction. So in the end, it turned out that the INC had been heavily infiltrated by Saddam's intelligence services. And Chalabi never achieved any kind of... He was like Minister of Transportation or some silly thing like that in the very beginning after Saddam was overthrown, but he never amounted to anything. And then he ended up dying of a heart attack shortly after. But this was all on Dick Cheney. Cheney forced him on us.
Wow. Yeah, it's crazy to think the amount of power that he was able to maneuver and steer in those days.
Oh, yes.